town hall is a leap of faith. At some point, there might be a technology hiccup, or one of my children might seek attention and just knock my entire computer over. Please open yourself to this time of listening with a generous heart. And with that, I will turn today's conversation over to Rozella.
Hello. Thank you so much, Megan, for your words and for this invitation and this initiative. My name is Rozella Haydée White. I use she, her, and hers pronouns. I am a spiritual life coach, leadership consultant, and writer. And my singular goal is to nurture life-giving, justice-seeking, and world-changing love in this world. I am so excited to be moderating today's panel with this town hall that's focused on minimizing bias. And we have invited some incredible Lutheran voices and leaders and folks who are faithful leaders, who are committed to justice, and who are also unapologetic about their identity. And so we're going to have a conversation. And we are also going to invite your questions for our panelists to engage after we engage in some conversations about this. Before we do introductions, though, what I wanted to do is to provide a little bit of framing as we talk about bias, right? So the invitation was for folks to come in to talk about how we minimize bias in Lutheran spaces, especially within the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and spaces that are aligned, institutions that are aligned with the denomination. And so bias is defined as prejudice in favor of or against one thing, a person or group compared with another, usually in a way that's considered to be unfair. And as a verb, it's that thing that causes someone or something to feel or show inclination or prejudice for or against someone or something. If you know anything about statistics and makeup, you know that the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America is the whitest denomination in the United States. And so we already know that there is a bias as it relates to being for folks who are of European descent. Now, I'm not speaking about individual feelings. I'm saying within the system and structure that we're a part of, there is a bias towards whiteness. And so again, this conversation is about exploring how we minimize bias given the various intersections that we embody. And the other word I'll say by way of definition and introduction is around the word intersectional, right? That's a word that we hear often and that's used very much in these moments and in this time. Intersectional and the concept of intersectionality was developed by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, an African-American scholar who talked about not only the varying identities that someone embodies, right? So I identify as a woman, I identify as someone who is Black and Puerto Rican, I identify as someone who is middle class, for whatever that means in this day and age, right? These are the intersections that I embody, but intersectionality is how I experience oppression because of those realities and those identities. So we're going to be talking about our various identities and the intersections that we embody, but we're also going to be doing that in a way that talks about the oppression and the bias that we face, right? So we're going to begin with some introductions, and in their introductory comments, I'm asking for each of the panelists to not only share their name, their context, and some of the intersections that they embody, but also how do these intersections impact or address how you are Lutheran, how you embody this Lutheran faith. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to call on each panelist to share. And so that helps to minimize the confusion, and hopefully we're able to go with the flow of conversation. And I'm totally going to do this alphabetically. And so just get ready. So we're going to begin with Evangeline. And so if you could share your name, your context, some of the intersections you embody, along with how these intersections inform who you are as a Lutheran.
Thank you. My preferred name is Evangeline because the other name doesn't really reflect my Chinese name. And my last name Dai, but you can pronounce my last name as Day because I realized that when I was in CPE, I introduced to the patients that I am Chaplain Dai and something like some kind of relate to death. So I changed my mind. I use Day, and Day is like the Taiwanese pronunciation of my last name, so it's appropriate. And I use she, her, hers pronouns. I was born and raised in Taiwan. Taiwan is not Thailand. Taiwan is the one that created the bubble tea. I was born in a non-Christian family. So in God's grace, I'm here now. I was baptized in 2014. And I became a Lutheran in 2015. My home church is Faith Lutheran in Bel Air, Texas. And I'm a candidate for Word and Sacrament in Texas, Louisiana Gulf Coast Synod. And now I'm taking MDiv program at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary in Berkeley, California. And how my intersections shape the way I'm a Lutheran. I have seen some statistics, not sure what year was it, but in that report, I am older millennials, so that's only 4% among ELCA members, so only 4% is very little. And too bad that report only has 2 genders, but I'm a female. ELCA apparently have more female members than male. It also makes sense that ELCA provides women more opportunities to serve. I'm a Taiwanese and I'm descendant of Chinese because not all the Taiwanese are descendant of Chinese. So I have to say that. We have indigenous and descendants of colonizers and immigrants all over the world. So it was a shock when I came to seminary and suddenly I realized that ELCA is the widest denomination, and because I didn't realize that in my home church, of course. So Asians are only 1% in ELCA. And I'm first generation immigrant, which is only 3% among ELCA members. And I also consider to be sexual minority. I didn't see a statistic for that, but I'm happy that ELCA is very affirming and welcoming. I think that's all I want to share.
Thank you, Evangeline. Pastor Hazel.
I was singing the ABCs in my mind. I'm like, I think I'm next. My name is Pastor Hazel Salazar-Davidson. I use she, her, ella pronouns. I am the campus minister over at California Lutheran University. So over down south from you, Evangeline. I am a first generation Costa Rican immigrant. I'm female. I'm a widow. I'm a mom. I'm an artist and I've been recently ordained just within the last 2 years. I think that's all my intersections so far that I can think of. And then the other question was, how do these intersections identify the shape and shape the way I am a Lutheran? I read this question earlier today, and I thought it was kind of a funny question because if I want to be blunt for just a second, I think it's a colonized question. I think that the idea that we have to be like one thing at a time is a very colonized way of thinking, because I don't think that any one thing in my identity is, I'm not bringing one thing to the table. In fact, I feel like I'm bringing all the things to the table. So like the way that I relate as a mother and as a widow and as an immigrant and as a woman and an artist is how I actually pastor in this space and how I am a Lutheran in the world. All of these things, they work together, not just as intersections, but as collaborations with one another. So I can't just like name like specifically one little thing. I think that they help me relate to people deeply, because I can identify all of them all at once, and in my relationship with how I see God and how I see the church in the world. So I think that's how I would answer this question at this point.
Thank you, Pastor Hazel. And I love how you said that there are questions and there are things that we ask and do that are decolonized within themselves. So thank you for bringing that up. I think I'm doing the ABCs in my mind too. So I think Olivia, you're up.
Yeah. Hello, my name's Olivia LaFlamme. I use they, them, theirs pronouns. and I am the program director for Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries. I live in Durham, North Carolina. I'm a Black, queer, non-binary person, and I am not Lutheran. So I think, you know, before I took the job with Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries, I didn't even know what a Lutheran was. And that was partially why I was hired by them. They were like, actually, it'd be really nice to have a different perspective. My background is as an academic, studying women and gender studies and queer theory. So I came to this job straight out of a master's program. And it has been really great. And I've learned a lot about being a Lutheran, but I'm still not a Lutheran. And everyone always jokes that I may become one day. I may go to seminary, but right now, the work that I do working with LGBTQIA folks in the ELCA makes it so that I would not do that because I feel like I know too much about what goes on behind the scenes. So it doesn't shape me to be Lutheran as so much as it maybe gives me a different perspective about what it means to be Lutheran from the outside. And personally, I practice a hybrid of religions that are some Christianity based, but mostly West African based. And that's my ancestral religion. So that's what I practice mostly, but it's a combination for sure, because my parents are both Christian. So yeah, I'm excited to be here and to contribute anyways, without being Lutheran.
We are so excited that you are here and that you are a member of our extended family by way of ELM in your role. And I'm fairly certain that you will have some incredible things to say as someone who is not of and working within and alongside that we can all learn from and listen to. So thank you, Olivia. QR, Rev.Tuhina.
Hi, my name is Rev.Tuhina Rasche. I use she, her pronouns. So I actually just celebrated my 7th year anniversary being ordained in the ELCA. And I actually serve now at University African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in Palo Alto. So I'm actually not, so it's a specialized call within the ELCA, but I'm not serving an ELCA congregation right now. I'm serving as minister of small groups. I am also the young adult coordinator for an interreligious organization called Arts, Religion, Culture, the Society for Theopoetics. And thinking about the places and the spaces that I occupy, like I am not just one thing. And I came from a devout Hindu background, but even that has seen some conflict because my father came from a mixed caste family. And being mixed caste in Hindu religion is considered to be actually really quite taboo. And so there was a lot of, so my father was very much looked down upon in Indian society for being mixed caste. And then he married my mother and my parents immigrated to the United States in 1970. So I'm 2nd generation Indian American. And I think part of me is Lutheran. Growing up in a Hindu household, I'm not gonna abandon generations of family tradition that are steeped in my bone and blood. And yet at the same time, Lutheran just happens to be the particular way, shape, and form that I follow Jesus. But I'm also within the AME Zion Church right now. And so for me, it's just, I just feel like Lutheran is a constrictive label. And I think like that's just one of the facets in which we experience the divine and the wideness and the grace of however we experience that divine presence. So yeah, I sound totally heretical right now too, but heretical is also the opinion of the minority. And so I think it's just, for me, it's the weaving together of traditions from past and present. And that actually is how I identify partly as Lutheran, because I also have this firm belief in the communion of saints. for the people who have gone before us, for us who are here today, and for those who are to come.
I am so excited about this conversation we're about to have. Like, this is going to be awesome. And last but certainly not least, by way of introduction, we have Prairie Rose.
Hey, Nawaj, Naga na di na siya na daddy steaks daddy wanana. Hello, my relatives, my sisters. I'm glad to be here. I call from my homelands. I was out doing horse chores and I forgot about the time zone difference. So I apologize, I'm a little tardy. But I come to you as the program director for the American Indian Alaska Native ministries within the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. My mom is a devout Lutheran. She's a proud German from Russia, settled in the Dakotas in the 1880s. And my dad is a full-blood American Indian, Northern Cheyenne, and Arikara, and other tribes by blood. My mom's family, they're the ones who kind of ethnically identify as Lutherans. So I used to say, well, I'm half Lutheran. I'm half Lutheran by blood, because they were Lutherans before they even called it the Lutheran Church, prior to going into Russia. I have spent just over 4 years within the ELCA church-wide structure. They pulled me in from serving a Native ministry in Eastern North Dakota that was serving both youth and homeless and those who are incarcerated. So I have a background of 15 years working with some of our hardest to serve populations, and I feel blessed to bring that into the spaces that I work within today. The intersections that impact my identity, first as an American Indian, as an Indigenous woman in a lot of these spaces, when I'm in some of the older Lutheran spaces, I'm very much a novelty. A lot of people in this country haven't met an Indigenous person. I used to wear more regalia because I felt it was kind of a protection for me when I walked into like dominant culture rooms and spaces. And so I had like, okay, I'm getting all my protection, I'm gonna smudge off and, you know, bring all my medicines in with me. And unfortunately that attracted more attention. I would get people coming up and touching me and hugging me, and it was too much. I'm more introvert. And so they brought me into this space, not necessarily unwillingly, but I didn't apply for this position. I joke around a lot that they knew what they were getting as coming in from working in the streets as an organizer and an activator of justice systems within a place like North Dakota, but within the region. And when I first got into those hallways, I talked a lot about the change that needs to happen. How do we operationalize cultures of justice and spaces of healing? And a lot of my work has been around challenging people's bias, their identities, and people take that personally. When you're in a dominant culture room and you're challenging white men about systems of white supremacy and practices that contribute to the culture of white supremacy, folks don't like that so much, because when you challenge their history, you challenge them. And it's been a time of learning for me how to mitigate the more painful reactions from dominant culture. But the real healing work that comes in as a Lutheran is going into Indigenous spaces. We have just about 40 American Indian Alaska Native ministries, most of which were inherited by other denominations. And to walk into those spaces and talk about what it means to be a Lutheran, most never had that conversation. When you come in and the Bible is a tool of oppression, and you are descendants of people who were told to convert or die, those spaces take time to build relationship and build trust, to even talk about healing. And I remember 4 years ago walking into an Alaska Native village and community and talking about racism and white supremacy, and the church just repudiated the doctrine of discovery, the foundation of white patriarchy, supremacy, dominion across the globe. And just now, 4 years later, communities are asking, well, can we change the name of our congregation? Can we change how we do this and integrate our cultural practices as Indigenous people? And I'm like, heck yeah. The Lutheran theology is a way to find a relationship with God through these practices that are established by the Lutheran Church. It isn't all who you are. So I'll stop there, but my identity as a Lutheran, it's complex, as other panelists have said before. I didn't have to out myself, right, until I got into the church, to be honest. Somebody was like, well, how long you been a Lutheran? I don't know, my family's been Lutheran since before it was called the Lutheran Church. Just thought everybody was Lutheran. When you go into native villages, it doesn't matter what denomination you are. Everybody is that particular denomination, whether it's Episcopal, Presbyterian, Catholic, Lutherans. We don't have a very large footprint in Indigenous lands and territories, but where we do, that's the church. That's everybody. Anyway, I'll stop there.
There is so much that is being shared, and I hope for those who are watching that you are taking notes, because I already know this is going to be a conversation that you're going to need to revisit. And also, we are going to have time for Q&A at the end of this time. So just be thinking through the questions that you have and that you want to share, and you can put them in your chat box, and we'll make sure that we get to what we can get to. I'm not going to promise we're getting to everything. And I am going to be looking at the questions before I share them to make sure that they are actual questions that don't do more harm. So there are a couple of things that were shared that I want to pick up on, and I already kind of let the panelists know. We're going to start with a conversation around colonization and decolonization. It's interesting, I didn't share this when I did my introduction. So I would normally say, which I'm actually starting to shift away from, when I would speak and go out and say, I'm a third generation Black Puerto Rican Lutheran, I'm a bit of a unicorn. And of course, cue the laughter, and people would be like, oh, you're like one of us, even though you look different than who we would normally associate as Lutheran. The number one question I would often get when I would be in Lutheran communities of faith was, when did you become Lutheran, right? Because the assumption is that I could not be someone who was a part of an inherited tradition and culture because I did not look European. And the reality is that the Lutheran Church as a place of formation and identity is the place that I have grown up in, my mother grew up in, my grandmother grew up in, right? So this is something that I know. And yet, I am not simply one thing, right? I love how Pastor Hazel and Pastor Tehina talked about the fact that we hold not only these multitudes of things, but we bring those things into this space. And so I want to start with a conversation around colonization and decolonizing, because the reality is that each of us on here have been on the receiving end of colonization in various ways, right? So whether it's the Great Scramble in Africa, whether it's the actual coming into your country of origin and having people take over, whether it's the slave trade, whether it is Native and Indigenous folks, American Indians, experiencing genocide at the hands of those who came to settle a place where people already are, we have all been on the receiving end of colonial powers, of colonization. And so the work of being also, I think, a person of color is that you are constantly dealing with these warring forces within yourself that come to bear in your identity. And so I think where I want to start in our conversation is, as you think about the colonial reality that is a part of your background, your story, your history, how have you started to engage or been on the journey of engaging decolonization? Because we recognize it also as something that happens with our thoughts and our ideologies, our beliefs, our practices, and our actual embodied way of being. So I would be curious about your thoughts around your own experience with colonialism, right? From the homelands that your ancestors have come from to now, the lands that you're in that were ancestral but have been taken over, and how you have engaged the work of decolonizing as it relates to your thoughts, beliefs, ideas, practices, behaviors, all of that. Everyone got the question or some version of the question? Yeah. And then I'm just going to ask, is there anyone ready to go first?
I'll go first. Why not? I'll jump in. I think so I didn't grow up Lutheran. I didn't say this before. I didn't grow up in the church at all. I'm Latin American. So of course I had seen like pictures of Jesus and the Virgin Mary. And I mean, that's just ingrained in the culture, right? Which is in and of itself colonization, right? But so I was really, so I've never been like trained in how to preach or how to speak in front of people, in front of a church. And so I couldn't help but just begin with storytelling. And I feel like that is a way that I've continued to try to work against like this idea of like how you're supposed to be and when you're in front of a church. I think that people from Costa Rica are very charismatic in the way that they tell stories, and they tell stories so that they're able to give like a lesson. So they wheel you in, right? Like my grandma does this, like she'll tell me like this huge story. And then in the end, it's all about like how I stayed up last night and like didn't come home. But like she wheels you in like with this amazing thing. And then it's like lesson learned, right? So I've noticed that I do that a lot with my sermons. And I have been called out on it, of course, by folks, specifically by white men who say like that I have a very interesting, which interesting is code word in Lutheran speak, for something that you don't like, I guess. Very interesting way of preaching the sermons. But I always respond with, you know, Jesus was a storyteller, and he didn't like stand in front of a church with people sitting in pews, but that he sat on the hillside, just like those folks that came and our ancestors that came before us. And he told stories that related to the people. And so how can you not expect me to teach the gospel in that very same way? And so I feel like just by connecting with that piece of my heritage has been really transformative for me. And I think being in spaces with other people of color, I actually spent a decade in Alaska, and that's where I became a Lutheran. So it was really great to be with Native folks and have them be at their dinner tables and have them tell me the tales and have them, my children, be all surprised of the things that they would tell, these stories that were handed down for generations. I think that those are the gifts of the Spirit. Okay. And I found this on the web. Okay, I don't know why Siri's asking me. But anyways, it's a generational gift. And I think that we need to continue to honor that as people of color. I think that it is something that we all have in common. And I think that the gifts of our stories and our ancestry are a gift to the church and the world. So that's it.
No, thanks for that, Hazel. And the code words, right? So for those watching, probably anyone who is connected to, affiliated with, alongside a Lutheran community starts to learn code words. Interesting, articulate. I'm sure the panelists can think of others that people say when you say or do something. Reverend Tuhina.
So part of what colonization has done to my family, and not even colonization, it's even like full-on assimilation, is robbing us of our stories. And so I've really been kind of like interested in somatics as it relates to scripture and the gospel and how we actually embody the word made flesh and the stories that and the words that create our flesh. And so that's something that I've actually been kind of turning around in my head for a long time, that I didn't know a lot of the stories of my parents growing up in India and of my grandparents and of my extended family. So the first time I was actually able to go to India was when I was 6 years old. And that's when I didn't realize that I was actually part of a whole different world. And that world I had not really known about. Like I'd known about it in like the blue airmail letters that came, that were written in Bengali and Hindi. And that's something that's also been taken away from me is the language. And so my father was the last person in our family to speak Bengali, and that died with him when he died. And also thinking about like the violence of assimilation, that when my parents immigrated to the United States, my dad was in school, but also to pay for school. And, he brought his new bride over, they have to live, they have to eat. So he would work second and third shifts at a manufacturing plant. And my dad became a shift manager. And he was essentially, he was actually the boss over a bunch of white people in Cleveland, Ohio. And so my dad, trying to do his job as shift manager, was telling the workers, like, you need to be at work on time. And it got violent to the point where they pulled a gun on my dad. And so it was this realization of like, we must assimilate and we must become as close to like what will ever keep us safe. And so I think that's when assimilation had really started becoming a dominant force in my upbringing, because I didn't realize how much of my own story I didn't know, and how much of my own family's story I didn't know. And so I will be decolonizing for the rest of my life. What has been done unto me, I will now have to untangle and unwrap and unbind and undo. And I think a big part of that for me is that I felt really, I decided to go to India by myself. I needed to be a brown person in a brown place. And, I have friends that are like, I want to go with you. And I'm like, no, I can't have you come with me. I just need to be. And so trying to rediscover and reclaim the history, the language, and just being that incarnate being of who God created me to be, and with my family's history and in that space and time. So I'm thinking about that decolonizing it will be a lifelong work for me.
And I think that's one of the things that many of us would say we want of our white counterparts, to recognize that this is a lifelong journey. There is no program, there is no training, there is no book.
Lord Brown baby Jesus, there is no book, okay?
That will change the thing that has been deeply seated and woven into the fabric, especially of the United States, but one could argue globally, but we're going to talk about here, but especially into the fabric of this place that we live. Any other thoughts around decolonization? Yeah, Olivia.
I would kind of go off of what Reverend Tehina was saying about having things stolen from you. And I, for me as a Black person, like, dispossession is the effect of colonization. So you have something, I'm going to take it from you, but it's mine. So now for me, I can't trace my family lineage back more than 4 generations. So I don't know exactly where my people came from originally. It's like impossible to know. And that's because of a lot of different things, but mainly racism and colonization, where, like, for example, census records is typically how people can go back and find family members. Well, a lot of Black people were illiterate that were enslaved in the United States. So the census taker would write down whatever they heard their name to be. And you can see in the documents, like, we were able to find one of my ancestors whose name was spelled differently every year in the census documents, because it was just word of mouth. And this person was not taking the care or time to write down this person's name properly. So the person, it's hard to find them. So that dispossession shows up in so many ways. But I think for me in my life now as a descendant of enslaved Africans is getting those things back, the things that belong to me, getting them back. So for me, that looks like somatic therapy. So I am in somatic therapy, where basically I dissociate. So for me, like, the inheritance of colonization looks like dissociation. It's a split between the body and the mind. So the mind functions to move you forward and do your things and go about your day and to go to work and all of those things, but your body is silenced because those messages can't be mixed. Otherwise you wouldn't survive, basically. So I'm working on getting that connection back, that connection that my ancestors had to survive. So now I'm able to work on healing that trauma on an individual level. And I pursue it that way. And the other thing that I think I do personally to deal with the effects of colonization is to literally have a relationship with my ancestors. So I practice an African traditional religion called Ifa. And in my room, there's an altar that has my ancestors' pictures on it, their names, offerings for them. And I literally have conversations with them. So that may be controversial. I don't know what to say in this phase, but it's what happens. I talk to them, they're around me, and that knowing that I can have that connection is part of the way that I am taking back what's mine, basically, because they're mine and I'm theirs. So if we can stay together even through this, then that's part of the reclamation for me.
Listen, Olivia, you are in good company. I would say at least I know 3 of us have altars in our house, and that is a non-negotiable. Prairie Rose.
Thank you. And thank you for those who've also shared. Well, if you let me share my screen, I have a 4-day PowerPoint on intro to colonization. Just kidding. The reality, living in occupied lands here, and it's 4th of July weekend, and we're talking about change the name of the Washington, you-know-who football team, and the desecration of Indian lands in South Dakota, and all the tearing down of Columbus statues across the country, and other remnants of American genocide. Like, this is the time where we need to reflect and react in a way that allows us a deeper learning and understanding, or an analysis of the American genocide that we lift up within our American exceptionalist histories that we all learn within these dominant culture schools. And even within the church, I find myself giving permission a lot to people of dominant culture. If you're going to be in a relationship with me or Indigenous people, or just somebody you don't know, if you're going to be in a relationship, you want to allow to be your whole self. And when you're your whole self, there's probably going to be some awkwardness in that truth telling and truth sharing and revealing and building these things. And some of that within this dominant culture in these spaces, we have to recognize the abuse and the power dynamics that we've inherited, and practice, right? What are the practices that we continue that harm our own communities? There's definite unlearning that's happening, but in that unlearning is this awkwardness, and I do that unapologetically. I just acknowledge, like, I'm learning here, like, taking the step. I want you to take the step with me. But that creation of space for healing, to decolonize. And when we talk to Indigenous people, I hear different definitions of what is decolonization. I mean, I hear some go as far as, well, you're taking the Christ out of institution because Christ is the excuse or the crutch that these institutions hold up to oppress and abuse and establish toxic power dynamics and relationships. And so you take the Christ out. I don't know if I go that far. But when we decolonize, we are definitely challenging the systems that we're all accomplices in perpetuating dynamics, policy, culture, and practices that harm others. So it's a constant unlearning and constant decolonizing for the rest of our lives. I grew up in a multicultural household where I learned about my father's matriarchal society. Our first being was a woman, right? If you understand that you come from the stars and the first human was a woman and a mother, it changes your whole lens in which you view the world, right? So when I step into the Lutheran spaces and I challenge that understanding, it isn't about saying mine's better than yours. It's just saying we all can have space here. And when I open up dialogue that's painful and become vulnerable and create that environment for sharing and healing, I don't do that just for me. I have to do that so that the dominant culture humanizes my lived experiences, humanizes my people. And that is a tool I don't like bringing out because it's painful, it's heavy, and it takes a few days to recover from those spaces. I see it transform others. And if somebody's got a better tool out there than becoming vulnerable and taking that weight on of that dominant culture, I'd love to hear about it. Because it seems like we have to get to those spaces that are so painful so that they can feel that and open up some empathetic heart and mind to now see a world through somebody else's lived experience. We don't have time for that. I'm tired of holding those types of spaces. It isn't easy work. And the reality is we just need better white folks. We need better folks in dominant culture. And that's not going to happen when we're dealing with systemic racism until we get the racists out of those systems. And that's not saying get rid of all white people. It's saying we've got some new practices that we need to learn how to operationalize if we're going to have justice and equity and parity and all of these things, honoring the whole selves of those around us. And I'll end there.
I just let out a deep sigh, like a deep breath, right? As I'm thinking, Olivia, what you were talking about, Prairie Rose, what you brought back around and pieced together based on what was said about the things that we hold in our bodies, right? And the pain and the exhaustion, the fatigue of constantly having to impress upon dominant culture folks that you are human, right? I'm thinking about that photo that came out of the civil rights movement of, it said, I am a man, right? I am a man. Like this notion that people who look a certain way or who embody various identities that don't look like the white dominant culture have to constantly argue for their humanity. It's exhausting. It's re-traumatizing. And we're all people that exist in primarily white institutions or alongside them in spaces, even though we all have our own spaces where we go for rejuvenation, renewal, where we can just be. It takes a toll on the spirit. And I'm curious, Evangeline, about your thoughts as someone who is in the midst of theological study, because I feel like one of the things that came out of my time in seminary was a decolonization of my theological frameworks around who God is, right? So what are you thinking as we relate to this conversation?
Yes, I didn't really think about decolonization before I came to seminary, but apparently I have sense of something, but I just didn't really sort it out. So first, I want to thank you all of you that share your perspective, and I have something that can somehow relate it to some of you. So first, my ancestors are Chinese, so Chinese culture is dominant culture in East Asia. So I came from dominant culture in my part of the world. And I'm also aware that to indigenous Taiwanese, Chinese are colonizers, actually, even though after all these centuries, now Chinese people are majority in Taiwan, but we are colonized before. But more recent colonization in Taiwan is Japanese. Japanese colonized Taiwan for a period of time. There were some brutal history, like killing some indigenous people or even Chinese people. But after that, they built railway, post office, and just modern civilization stuff. They bring more some good things to Taiwan. So right now, most Taiwanese don't hate Japanese, but appreciate them build Taiwan, so we can be more modern country right now. And on the other hand, in Christianity, so I before I became Christian, I learned that in Taiwan, most Protestants don't pay respect to their ancestors. That's like that's my perception before I became Christian. But so I bring this out because last month in the service for the Emmanuel Night on June 17th, I watched a service video, and there was a pastor explain that venerating ancestors are not, it is not idolatry. So I appreciate that. That's part of something I want to share to decolonize. So I wrote a brief article, and also I can share that the pastor also have an article on Living Lutheran. So I can share the link to the chat shortly after. So I think because most people think Taiwanese Christian don't venerate ancestors. So that's one of the reasons they don't feel like to convert to Christianity. But if we decolonize that, we change that, realize that paying respect to ancestors is not idolatry. Maybe we can do something to make people feel more comfortable around that. So one thing I know that in Vatican II, Catholics announced that venerating ancestors is not idolatry. So in Chinese and Vietnamese Catholic churches, they have a service to venerate the ancestors. And I wonder maybe we can do something like that too. But I think many people right now still living in Taiwan, it's not on the track to decolonize. Like if I didn't come to seminary, probably I will just don't think about it either. So maybe we should do something at the leadership level to do some change. Thank you.
And Evangeline, I mean, you're hitting on something that I think is both pervasive and true of the reality we exist in, right? That the traditions, the culture, the ancestry that is a part of who I am, a lot of times has to be checked at the door in white spaces or in dominant culture spaces. And I cannot bring to bear the fullness of my identity, my spirituality, my way of experiencing and knowing God, because it does not fit within the parameters that have been defined outside of who I am, right? And then you live this dissociated, Olivia, to your point, like existence. And so I also want people to hear that when you are hearing people talk about reparations, it's because literally we have been dispossessed. Material things have been taken. And so the call for reparations is to recognize that and to make it right. And I don't know that we can get to some of the other things that we like to talk about, reconciliation and renewal and restoration, without doing the hard work of reparation and the recognition that shit was taken, that ways of being and like land, ways of being, identity, all of that. And so we have to actually reckon with that in order for us to do anything else to move forward. So as we're talking about this, right, this decolonization, I think one of the things I'm curious about, and we'll have this round of conversation, and then I think a couple of questions have come in, but we'll have this round of conversation before we get to that, is how do you exist continually in spaces that often ask of you to bifurcate your psyche, your body, your being? how do you continue to exist? And maybe also why? Why do you continue to show up in these spaces? Because I would argue, if it's not life-giving, you don't have to do it. If it's something that is asking you to not be the fullness of who you are, there was no shame, right, in walking away. And yet I know we all persist and show up because there's something else that's going on. So I would be curious, how do you articulate that? Why do you persist? Why do we continue in this space, in these spaces? Whoever wants to go.
I can go. I feel like, one, that wherever I am is for a time. So I'm at ELM right now, Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries. I will not be here forever. So right now, it's my calling to be with these folks doing this work, and the day will come when that's no longer true. So I'm kind of always on the, have my senses up around, am I overstaying? Should I move on? Am I getting a message to leave? So I don't ever stay somewhere longer than I think I should. So part of me being able to navigate with all of my identities and all the things that are coming at me is knowing that I'm never anywhere permanently. So kind of this transience becomes a way to move through. And I also think that I mentioned having a relationship with my ancestors before, and they have mandated that I do the work that I'm doing. So I have to show up in a certain way. And I have spiritual imperatives that have been given to me. I have to show up a certain way regardless. So for me, yes, things are coming at me. Yes, there's racism. Yes, there's homophobia, transphobia, ableism. There's all these things that come at me on a daily basis, even doing the work that I'm doing at a nonprofit that's for LGBTQ folks in the church. Even there, it's nowhere is safe from these things. The way I cope with that is knowing that I'm doing what I came here to do, period. So I'm not confused about that in any moment. And sometimes that looks like me showing up and flipping tables. And sometimes that looks like me not saying anything and just sitting in the background and just witnessing. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it's a one-on-one conversation. And sometimes it's being on a panel, it just depends. I just take opportunities when it feels appropriate. But other than that, I'm just showing up in the way that I'm supposed to show up, the way that my ancestors asked me to show up, and the way that I would want, my kids to know that I showed up this way. So it's all a mixture, time is not linear. So ancestors are sitting here, my future children are sitting here, their children are also sitting here. We're all together at the same time. So I am being accountable to them. It's not, well, I'm going through so much, I get to treat people bad. I get to, slack off at my job. I get to, because that's what I have to deal with so much. Nope, I have a different mandate, sorry. So I'm doing what I came here to do, as Audre Lorde said, and that's it.
Listen, the clear mandate, right? And also that mandate flowing out of an ancestral connection and a collective wisdom. This idea that time isn't linear, right? In and of itself, the way we think about time as colonized, that's a whole other panel conversation when people don't want to take the time to do that. But anyway, this notion that time isn't linear, and this recognizing that you are very clear in who you are. And anyone who knows me and knows how I work, I always start with that question or invitation for people to understand who they are and what they value, because those two things will lead you forward. Thank you. Thank you. So why do we persist?
God calls us to life abundant. I still firmly believe that. And I also think that I have a choice. I can say yes and no. That one of my previous calls was not life abundant. And I realized that I was compartmentalizing myself. Like during the day, I was like this perfect little associate pastor who was in this predominantly white congregation. And then at night, I would literally go to the other side of the bay and be marching in protests. And I realized, like, I felt like I was living a split life, and I couldn't integrate that with one another. And I think when I was in that call, I was being asked to compromise the entirety of who God created me to be. And I realized that I was suffering spiritually, I was suffering physically, I was suffering emotionally. And it just kind of came to the point where I really had to have a conversation with God and be like, I don't think I'm called to this. I don't think you called me to this. And it was the realization of, yeah, I wasn't called to that. And it was kind of a shock that it was a short call. It was a really short call. But this realization of, I have a choice. I have a choice. I don't have to sit in misery. I don't have to insert myself in spaces where I'm not wanted. Like if it's a space where it's like, you're gonna, if it's a space where it's like, I'm gonna be tokenized, like I tell people, like, if you ask me for a speaking engagement, or if you ask me to show up at a place, you'll get all of me. You don't get to pick and choose who you get. You don't get to pick and choose like the fractions and the facets. You get all of this. And so you get my delightful quirkiness, but you can also get my very honest, like, this is not right. And so I think part of what gives me life abundant is that God calls me to life abundant, and God calls me to ask for life abundant for my neighbor as well. And sometimes life abundant for my neighbor does not look pretty to my neighbor.
Sometimes life abundant to my neighbor, for me, does not look pretty to my neighbor. Is that what you just said, T?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying, right? Like, but what I didn't hear you say is that life abundant for you does not equal life abundant or a non-abundant life for your neighbor. Mm-hmm. I heard you say what is life abundant to you may not look pretty to your neighbor, mm-hmm. but it does not equal not abundant, right? I just want to.
Yeah, but it doesn't detract from other people having life abundant. It's not like I'm going to take your piece of the pie.
Exactly.
We all get pie.
Because abundance, right, in and of itself is a mindset. And the thing that I say all the time too is that we live in an era and a tradition that is like clutching to the promise of scarcity, not the promise of abundance, right? So even the work of decolonization, while mm-hmm. it might be scary for some people, and maybe for all of us, because there's all this stuff within us that we have to root out, the reality is that by clinging to a promise of abundance, we are actually pushing back against the lie of scarcity. And for those of us who are of the Christian faith and tradition, that the promise of abundance is what is in line with scripture, is what is in line with our story, not this belief in scarcity, right? Sorry. So, and see, the other thing you said that I wanted to highlight, I keep going because there's so much, and I'm trying to take notes and listen and call out the not pretty. It's going to come back to me. Oh, agency, choice. I have a choice. I have a choice where I'm gonna show up, how I'm gonna be when I show up, what time, like I have a choice. And I think that this is something that people of color, even as we have to show up in ways and spaces and places where all of our things are on all the time, we recognize that we have agency. The thing that always gets me is when dominant culture folks in our context, white people, act like they don't have a choice. And I'm like, why don't you have a choice? You can be different. You can spend your money differently. You can enact different policies. Why do you feel like it's not a choice? And I feel like that is a major lie of colonialism, of white supremacy, of racism, that you don't have a choice to create a different reality when we believe in a God who actually made us as co-creators. Like that is the work that we're called to create, to recreate towards abundance for all. Other reasons or other thoughts about why we continue to show up? And we're getting questions, so we will have some questions. But anyone else on the panel?
For me, it was justice. This top-down definition of what justice was for the dominant culture. And it was in reality this practice of toxic benevolence, right? Like we know what you need. We're gonna give it to you, into your communities. And I wanted to step into this space to ask our communities, what does justice mean to them? A lot of our congregations within the Indigenous communities didn't have that choice. And with the changes in the church and, potential restructuring of what's coming in the future, we don't know. Um, it feels like the whole time I've been in this structure, it's been a time of transition. And nobody was communicating with our Indigenous communities and how they fit into that transition. They were told how they would fit in by synod leaders, by church-wide leaders, and that to me doesn't work. That isn't acceptable. That's a colonized practice that needs to stop. And so we're impacting people's lives and their quality of life. And when I showed up into these spaces, I found myself, creating healing spaces for our Indigenous communities, but then also walking into those dominant culture spaces as my whole self as best I could. Again, with what Olivia had pointed out too, there's a timeline to it. I'm only going to be here for an hour. I'm only going to be here for 3 days on stage for 20 minutes at a time, right? Like I as an organizer, there's always an end date. Either it's election or a vote or some sort of end date, right? And so I put that same concept into the work that I have within the church-wide structure, knowing I'm going to be traveling for 2 weeks. I'm going to take a week without travel. I'm going to travel for 4 weeks. I'm going to take 2 weeks without travel. Like I tried to build that in as best I could, with the exception of my first year, because my position had been open for almost 7 years. And before I came on board, I wanted to establish some boundaries. That first year was hard because I was like this balloon picked up in a tornado that just kept going, and the year passed, and I was like, "What happened? Where did I just go?" And that's when I realized I needed some better boundaries. But that was a learning piece. There was so much urgency because there's been this vacancy for so long, and the deficiencies created within that vacancy, and so much erasure happening to further disparity and to create disparity with Indigenous communities within the church-wide structure, funding mechanisms, all of these processes that were like the roots of dysfunction and distrust. So I wanted to see if I could rebuild some of that creatively with the communities that we serve. And that isn't easy work. And I think I put myself in a position of not necessarily failure, but I put too much on saying, why am I not communicating with my partners more, my colleagues more within the church-wide structure? And so going into it, my third year, after taking some time to work at those intersections of where we can within the church-wide structure, it isn't easy. This is a structure that has siloed us. You're African descent here, you're Latino here, you're American Indian Alaska Native here, et cetera, right? So you fit into these spaces, and it's really hard to find alignment within those spaces. Unless it feels good to the dominant culture, let's do this, multicultural thing. And again, this toxic benevolence of like, we know what you need, communities. And the communities coming forward saying, oh, this again? Didn't we do this like 2 months ago or last year or like every year for the last 20 years? We're tired. So trying to break those cycles of practices that just weren't working and bringing more people to the table. I may not have been successful with some of the work that came with the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery, because most of that came from the dominant culture itself. But I feel like I've been successful at re-engaging and connecting American Indian, Alaska Native, Indigenous leadership across the footprint of the church in a way that establishes meaningful relationship within that community. Not necessarily the relationship with their synod or their church-wide structure, but with each other. Like that's been healing to me. And that's what feeds me and energizes me. And when I walk into these dominant culture spaces and it's still draining, I mean, how many of us are on, 24-hour Zoom calls? It's just endless. I did something frivolous this weekend. I'm picking up a horse. I bought this beautiful old 18-year-old gelding who's a dancing horse and a trail horse. And I was like, I don't know where I'm getting this money, but I'm buying this horse because I'm out in the country during this pandemic. And I think, I've got wild horses out here that I take care of, but I was like, I need a friend. We're out here and, what, I mean, my mom thinks it's frivolous, but I was like, Mom, you have no idea. Like, I need a horse. So I found this horse and he was for sale and I was like, I'm getting him. And that's feeding my spirit, and I'm so looking forward to like this relationship with this being. I've met him twice and he's this big beautiful being that just there's so much energy, and I feel like that's a relationship I need in my life right now, one that gives that life. And he's gonna love it out here. There's 200 acres of beautiful greenness and lush grassland and water. I mean, he's gonna love it, and I'm just like, I can't wait to share this with him. So, I mean, my boyfriend probably will feel neglected, but I'm getting a horse, so I don't care what anybody says.
Listen, and that beautifully connects to where you started with justice, not only external, but internal. This is justice for you, right? Justice is about liberation, about freedom, about experiencing joy, and you're doing it. You're doing it. So Evangeline and Hazel, do you all have anything you want to add? Go ahead, Evangeline.
So definitely justice. I always wondering why God called me into the position I'm in right now, but all the way from Taiwan to United States. And after I get more into ELCA, I realized that, yeah, this is the right place. If I stay in Taiwan, probably I will leave Christianity, maybe, because they in Taiwan, most Christians are known of homophobia or things like that. And also, I had a lot of my personal history. Just after I came to ELCA, I feel this is so welcoming, affirming. This is a comfort zone, safe zone for me, for sure. Yeah, so I thank God that called me into this space. So justice, for sure. My eyes were opened here in the United States, in ELCA. I learned so many different things from different perspectives. Although this is very white denomination, but we always raise voice from like people of color, women leaders, or LGBTQ leaders, and I learned so many things. And I know real justice that God called us to do, I believe, is what we are doing now. And I think, yeah, that's right. In a ELW, Evangelical Lutheran Worship book, we have a prayer for the church. And I really like that what we are doing, if that's right, pray to God that strengthen it. And what we are not doing right, believe that the Holy Spirit will lead and guide us to correct that. And we are always reforming, right, reformers. Thank you.
Thanks, Evangeline. How about you, Hazel?
Why do I persist? I think I persist because I was surrounded by community when I felt like I couldn't persist. And so that is like the core of like what my call is, I believe. Like I became a widow in the middle of seminary. I was in Alaska without any family, surrounded by a very conservative community, but yet there was this gem of a Lutheran church who like came alongside me and believed in me enough to like help me put me through seminary, take care of my kids, help me travel back and forth to California to finish my degree. So when I received the call to California Lutheran, I was like, of course, this is my call, because I mean, it's the best damn call in the whole world. I get to like be around college students and excite them and get them excited about what it is that they're going to do in the world and in the future, and help them and encourage them as they continue to persist for their goals. And I think that in a society that is very colonized and very individualistic, where we're taught from the very beginning that we are supposed to like work really hard so we can be the best an individual that we could possibly be. It's very different to come alongside people and say, I want you to work really hard so that you can give back to your community and be a neighbor. So I persist because my community challenges me to keep doing so, and that I get to challenge them when they don't want to, and they get to challenge me when I don't want to, which I haven't been wanting to lately because it's just like a lot. It's been a lot of emotion, a lot of being tired and feeling a lot of trauma coming back up. But I am like rejuvenated by the students here, by the way they continue to strive for something better. And I'm excited to see that those are the students, those are the elders that my children are looking at, right? Because I am working with these students, but my kids who are like 15, 14, and 10 get to see these students kind of rise up in the world. And so together we become this really beautiful community. So that's why I keep going. Sometimes it's really hard. I'm gonna be honest. I haven't been a Lutheran very long. It would be really easy for me to just be like, that was really swell, and like walk away. But I do think that it's gonna be really difficult, but I think that our denomination is gonna make some really great changes in the near future. I am inspired by the people I'm seeing on this panel and the work that we get to do together. I don't think I would stay if there weren't people like you all in this denomination doing this work with me. I would definitely be like packing my bags and moving on down the road. But I think it's community that anchors me, and community that helps me to persist, even when I'm in a bad mood. So, and I also did something frivolous, but I'll save that for the next question.
Well, now I'm curious. I can't wait. Okay.
Want me to tell you?
Yeah.
I bought a pottery wheel. Even though I don't have a kiln or anything. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to start throwing pots. And then when I get really pissed and like there's too much stuff coming up, I can break the pots and start over. But I'm excited to be doing art again and to be experiencing and releasing trauma and releasing things in my body that I've been holding for a long time through some art. So yeah, I am all for the horse, Prairie Rose.
Yes, this is incredible. And it's interesting as we sit here and consider this, some of the questions that have come up. And what I'm going to invite us to do is, if there's a question that you hear that resonates, we don't have to all answer all the questions, but if there's one that resonates, just chime in. So one of the first questions was talking about how our experiences, our identities, traditions, and theology, they have enriched many folks who are of the dominant culture, who are a part of the denomination. And the way that we understand God has been a gift and enriching. How does the church recognize and reflect on this without appropriating it, right? So all of these experiences, these ways of being, these ways of knowing have been enriching. And I believe that that's also because in the diversity, we are able to see a more expansive vision or view of God. But how does this continue to persist without it being appropriated? Does that make sense?
Well, we haven't done it well because we continue to create novelty around unique identities within the church, right? I haven't, there's like, there's no model we can suggest that does it well within a church structure that I've seen. I've seen communities on the frontline level, on the grassroots level, who embrace and create that welcoming environment that our theology teaches us to do, but they're so rare. And you know, I think of the first time I went to Alaska, and it was for the spring celebration, and some on this panel or this gathering might be familiar with the spring conference in Alaska, amongst the Alaska Native communities, where they come together and they do feasts and singing, and mostly like from the high Lutheran perspective. So they're singing hymns that are broadcast almost across the entire state, that even go into Russia. It's amazing. But prior to those live radio broadcasts with the sings that they're doing storytelling and culture sharing from each village. And I thought that was a part of all of this naturally, because it was my first time there. And then to see it abruptly end because a pastor from the dominant culture said, it's time to get on schedule for the radio broadcast, so we need to stop all this. So she stopped like this grandpa and his grandsons and these musicians from the community on their traditional instruments and sharing their stories, like just jumped up and stopped everything. And I felt I was hurt. I was hurt, and I could see the hurt in the community members. Were like, okay, I guess we got to do the church thing. It was, I mean, even though that was celebrated, it wasn't celebrated in a way that was shared with everybody. Like, it was still done in private, like in this back room of this congregation. And I asked, like, why can't these stories and songs be shared on the radio broadcast? And somebody said, well, they're not Lutheran. They're not Christian. And I was like, oh, this is not all of who we are. Like, we have to be embracing this. And so that's just an example of the dominant culture, again, controlling, you know, those who they want to bring in, or they say they want to bring in with their whole selves and identity, but they're controlling it. And now if it was up to the community, they would be sharing those stories and their songs and their language on the radio broadcast. If all of Alaska Native villages and Russia, but it's just, sorry to be the negative one that says we're not doing it well. I mean, we can do this by supporting and truly welcoming and letting community lead versus this expectation of, here's this box that we're trying to fit in. I'll check there.
I don't think that was negative. I think that was honest. And you basically said that we've got to center and stop marginalizing, and also who gets to say what is Lutheran. I mean, I think that's a part of the crux of all of this. Who gets to say what's Lutheran? And is Lutheran a theology? Is it a culture? Is it all of the above? And if it is all of the above, is it only white cultural ancestry that defines it? Or is it Black cultural? Is it indigenous cultural? Like, there are all of these cultural realities that are tied up in Lutheranism, but we only normalize and center one. So I think Prairie Rose is right.
I also think we need to think about, like, that the ELW is not the Bible, right? So, like, I mean, it isn't. I didn't learn that in seminary. So maybe liturgy is a little bit too boxed in. Maybe we're just like deciding that we have to have it a certain way because everybody's had it a certain way for so long that they can't even like think outside this box and say, hey, you know, we could do it a whole different way. And I'm not just talking about letting like the Latin folks and the Black folks make their own liturgy books either, because I don't want to make a book. I want to decide on like the fly what I want to do and what songs I want to sing. And like, you know, that's not how we did church way back in the day. So, you know, some of us didn't have like the hymns and the liturgy all written out for us on a bulletin. Sometimes it just was in a tent or out in the field and we were singing, and then we started praying, and then we started doing these other things. So I think we just really, we get stuck in our ways and we stifle out art we stifle out music and we stifle out people's voices because we're so stuck in what needs to happen in the liturgy. That's me. I don't know.
No, that's great. And this, I'm going to put two questions kind of together that came up because I think they have similar implications. One is around honoring the vulnerability and work that Black and Indigenous people of color are doing, especially when they aren't relationships with them. So one of the examples that has been raised is lifting up Patreon accounts, providing financial resources, but how do folks of dominant culture honor the work without also demanding more work? And what does it look like for people in the dominant culture? I'm not going to use the word ally because I like the word accomplice more, to be accomplices in this work, right? So how are some ways that our vulnerability and our work can be honored alongside with what does it look like, or how are ways that the dominant culture can be accomplices in this work? So does anyone feel pulled to either of those questions?
Give us our land back.
And here's the thing, you say that and you chuckle, but when we say that, people are like, oh no, that's not what I want to do.
Oh yeah, we got white churches in South Dakota contemplating. I shouldn't say white churches. We have people within those congregations contemplating what does it look like if we gave our vacation home in the Black Hills back to the Lakota people. I was like, don't question it, just do it, right? Just do it, and don't put any strings attached to it. Don't have the expectation that you're gonna get fall over thank yous for giving our land back. It's not going to happen. Like, we're not going to be so grateful, right? But the reality is too, I mean, panels like this and others where we're invited to share our stories, you know, compensate people, right? Like, those are pieces where you want to honor that time and value those voices and lived experiences within our community, right? The expectation is that we do this for free all the time. I mean, I'm grateful for these opportunities because I'm invited by friends to do this work and to share in these experiences. But when you're wanting to be if you're from the dominant culture and you're wanting to be more woke, I mean, don't tell yourself that you're woke. Let other people tell you that for you. But show up. Don't take over, right? We have a lot of A-types within the Lutheran culture where they show up, they got the budget, they have a timeline of goals to achieve in the next year and how we want to, you know, be in relationship with one another. Stop doing that, right? Let the relationship naturally unfold. If you keep showing up, you're going to be invited to be a part of whatever is going on, whatever change is happening. And if you've got resources to add to that, you know, make it known, right? Speak up and build those relationships, and the change is going to happen at the speed of trust and relationship building. And that isn't overnight, right? We think we can change 100 years of they'll come to us culture with a program grant or an event. It's not going to happen. Like, that stuff takes time. Build it in to create meaningful relationships with one another. And I know people don't really want to do that kind of stuff because it takes time, but there are those among us who want to heal those relationships among us. And I know my generation is more healed from my father's generation, who went through boarding school, who went through displacement, who went through the flooding of our lands. You know, I was born with inherent anger, right? Because of those things. But I know I'm healed enough to carry on some of the work. And the next generation, my children, and they're going to be even more healed away from those pains to do more of the work. And so change does take time, but when it's going to happen willingly, there's going to be an alignment of hearts and minds and people showing up. And we need, like I said before, better white folks, you know, to do what it takes to get things done. And I say, give us land back, you know, support our communities, buy native, buy, you know, the art and the pieces to add to your own home. I'll be sharing, I even on my social media, different accounts, because artists throughout the pandemic have a whole economy I wasn't even aware of until they can't feed their children anymore, right? So there's different ways that we can support one another. And it's not just cash or land, it's those relationships and bringing us into those spaces that we're non-existent in.
I mean, I heard you say just do it. Stop talking about it. Just do it. Right? Anybody else? We're coming up on time, and there's the one question that I had presented earlier that someone else also asked around what is most life-giving, what makes you feel alive right now. I think a lot of times we commodify our pain and trauma, but we don't actually express, at least publicly, our joy. So that's why I'm like, nah, it's not frivolous to buy a horse. It's not frivolous to get I don't even know what a painting, whatever you call it, the thing to make pottery, right? Like, I'm at the beach right now, and it's not frivolous to do this because I got friends that had a house. It's like, your family, here, take it, have fun. Even though I'm looking at fucking Trump flags everywhere because it's only white people out here, but that's a whole other thing, right? But we're gonna get our healing as we can. So what is life-giving for you in this moment? If you would be interested in sharing.
Donuts.
Tehina is the donut connoisseur, and she actually met recently a donut she did not like. I think it's the first time in our friendship that that happened. Is that correct?
It's the first time it's ever happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's like and for somebody who has, I think, like thinking about like somatic trauma, like I have a lot of anxiety, and my anxiety prevents me from eating. And so trying to figure out like, what are the things that I can take back? And one of the things that I can take back is eating donuts. And it sounds, and part of it sounds like really ridiculous. It's like, so yeah. And I think part of it is finding joy in the absurdity of it. That's actually a big part of it for me. Like, some people think it's a joke for me, but it's actually like, it's literally a holy practice. Yes. No, I think it's like, it's a holy and centering and spiritual practice of like, getting centered in the, like what in my life am I seeking to fill the holes? Kind of like, where am I seeking sweetness in my life? Like, I actually do meditate upon this. And so my joy comes in donuts. My joy comes in spending time with my spouse. Being silly, laughing, hula hooping, like I find it in actually very circular and non-linear things.
I love it. Olivia, how about you? What's giving you joy or life-giving right now?
Can I be honest? I think y'all can trust that I have joy in my life. I have joy. I feel like, just so you know, I have it. What I really want to say before we're at time is that I feel like something that could be helpful to start. Everybody wants to know, what can I do? What can I do? Okay, first, I think you should just set a different goal, because this panel itself is called Decreasing Bias. And I'm like, why are we decreasing it? Why aren't we eliminating it? Like, I think words really are powerful here. And for me, it's like, we need to pick a different goal. So I would hope that people, if you're listening to this, if you have some relative power in your life, everyone does, let's pick some goals that actually feel like what we're trying to get to, which also might mean calling it by the name of the thing that it is. Like, are we getting rid of racism? Are we getting rid of homophobia? Maybe we're getting rid of all of it. Maybe we're getting rid of sin, hate, oppression, whatever you want to call it. Like, I just want to call it by the name of what it is, because it's not bias. So I just wanted to put that out there. I've been holding it this whole time, waiting for an opportunity. That's it. And I am very happy, very joyful in my life. So.
Love it. Love it. Any others? Last thoughts, comments, joy, or anything else?
I was going to share this before, but I'm going to jump off of Olivia. Because I think a lot of congregations are doing a lot of good things, like reading books and having listening circles and maybe having POCs, the voices in the forefront. But Lutherans are really great about having potlucks and book clubs and talking and thinking. And at the end of the book club, they do nothing. So I want to know what the action is that you're doing with your congregation to be anti-racist. what's the part that you're actually doing? Because reading and talking isn't actually doing anything. So before I became a campus minister, I was a mission developer in Alaska. And I would go to these community organizing trainings, and I worked really closely with my local organizer to understand like the population that I was actually physically living in and serving, and how I could come alongside them and in the issues that they were important to that specific community. And honestly, I think that a lot of congregations should have healthy relationships where they're with their community organizers. Those are the people who
Hold on, Hazel, you're breaking
more
up.
than the pastor. And I'm going to say as a
Yeah, go back to the pastors congregation should have relationships with community organizers, and then it started to break up.
The community organizers of color, because oftentimes those are the people who have like the pulse of the community, and they know their community better than the pastor, because the pastor's usually stuck in the church dealing with a whole bunch of crap and the book clubs that are happening inside the church. So we need to have better listening campaigns. We need to be with the organizers on the street, and we need to surround ourselves with the community. We need to hold people accountable. A lot of people are doing and saying things and supporting movements that are going on right now, but we need to have accountability and hold hard conversations and be willing to make ourselves uncomfortable and listen to people in their uncomfortableness, or else we're not going to get rid of bias, and we're not going to like continue forward, and this church isn't going to be what I want it to be for my kids and for your kids, Olivia, for your kids, because that's where I'm at. I want to see that for all of our kids. So I think we need to make people work harder. That's all. And I have a lot of joy in my art studio. I made this. Okay, that's it.
Got it. Evangeline, any closing thoughts?
I think it's very important to educate our kids and youth in the church, but also that the kids, especially the ones belong to minority groups, to talk or share and take some leadership. But also before that, we need to educate our leaders and teachers, because bias can also like influence how the teachers teach the students, and maybe we will create a cycle if the teachers has bias already. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. We need to break the cycle. And
Thanks, Evangeline. Prairie Rose.
Yeah, give us our land back. That'll bring lots of joy. I honestly, from someone working at Churchwide who's traveling 30 weeks out of the year, this pandemic has allowed me to stay home and, deepen relationships with my family and my partner, and, show me what is the things I was kind of pushing off, right? And the grief that I've experienced over the last couple of years to deal with that, right? Like, so this, this new horse that I'm getting, he, I walked into this corral, and he came right up to me, and I'm like, oh, who's this guy? And the woman's like, well, he's never this friendly with other people. And, he chose me. And I just felt like, well, I'm going to make this happen. And that kind of stuff, just to share the beauty of all this with another being, my partner and our little pod of people here, it's beautiful. And I'm questioning how I go forward in the church-wide structure if we go back to practices that were, taking me away from all that. The sacrifice that my family made for me to be away to do the work that I did, and I continue to do, but is that the right vehicle for me? So it's really allowed me to reflect back on that in my own practices and what is giving me joy, and to focus on that, because, I've lost a lot of people recently in the last few years, in very tragic ways, and we're all we got. And I can do this work till I'm blue in the face with dominant culture and see some changes, but I got to value those lives that are right here, right now. before we're not anymore. So that gives me joy.
Wow. Well, my final thoughts are as follows. One, what's giving me joy right now is this lipstick, and it's from a Black-owned company called The Lip Bar, and I love it. And a few of my friends who are on this have texted me and told me that they love it too, so thank you. Two, rest and renewal. I too engage in somatic healing work and energy healing work and things that bring me back in my body, because when you are raised in a space and place where you're told that who you are is inhumane or does not, should not benefit from things like rest, even though my ancestry is that we built and we worked and we created, to spend time resting is in fact revolutionary and radical. Three, the things that I've heard on this call around being clear about your call, being clear about the vision for the work that you're engaging, being connected within a community, and recognizing that what you're doing is not solely about you, but about the folks that have come before, the folks that are to come, and recognizing that history, that this is a moment in history. This is not the end all be all, that people have gone through stuff before, will go through stuff in the future, and we are doing what we can do in this time and place to seek and enact and embody justice. And then lastly, this notion that people are always asking what they can do. And the reality is that you just have to do something, right? And you've gotten information in other spaces and places about what you can do. Buy in Indigenous places, Black Indigenous people of color. Use your resources and vote with your feet and your money, which is what we do. Vote. Support candidates who are about the holistic flourishing of people who do not look like the dominant culture, period. Third, interrogate your theological framings, identities. If everyone you hear is white, if everybody who preaches to you only preaches from white sources, if you never hear names of other folks, ask some questions of your pastor. 4, reparations, land, community, space, give it back, do it. 5, or C, whatever we're on now, thinking about churches and the fact that we are living in communities and our churches are bastions of resources, buildings, land, all of that. How are we spending our money? If your church has an endowment, which endowments in and of themselves are inherently problematic, we're storing up treasures theologically. Also, what are you investing in to build that endowment? You've got to do the work of interrogating money. And the last thing I would say is that capitalism and colonization are bedfellows, right? They go hand in hand. So we also, as people of faith, have to interrogate and problematize the systems that we cling to, especially, this is a perfect time, 4th of July. And if you haven't read To What is 4th of July to the Slave, or To the Slave, What is 4th of July by Frederick Douglass, do that. That would be some great reading, along with watching Hamilton, if that's what you do as well. But this is the time to do it. I'm so grateful for you who are panelists. Hey, Hazel, what were you gonna say?
I was going to say that would be a great Sunday sermon.
Just play that, just listen
Take
to
a
that.
break, pastors, and read that to your congregation.
Well, and better yet, Frederick Douglass's descendants have read it out, right? So you can find the recording of Frederick Douglass's descendants reading about To the Slave, What is 4th of July. But thank you so much for your time. Megan, I don't know if you wanted to come in and say anything by way of the next town halls and this initiative. I'm going to ask panelists if you can stay on for just a second after everyone goes, but yes, Megan.
Thank you. I wasn't planning on popping back up. I thought, the more your faces were centered, the better our world will be. So, but yeah, anyone who, if you would like to check into our next town hall, we are here every Friday listening to different diverse voices. I try not to add adjectives to other people's stories. So you'll need to pop on next week and see the next group of folk we have curated to have conversations like these. One thing that I do want to say, because it might invite more people to join us, is next week we'll have live ASL translation. And so pop on if you're able, and if you're not, you can always check out the archive. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.